Hello, everyone. Welcome to Why Kegels Aren't Enough. I'm Lisa Gillespie, and I will be your guide over the next hour as we take a look at what your particular alignment and movement habits are, what some of them are, and help you evaluate how they may factor into what you're experiencing with your pelvic floor and what would be more supportive for pelvic floor function. As we get started, I want you to see if you can have on hand a makeshift plumb line. So we're looking for something like a phone charger cord is usually the easiest and most readily accessible. A jump rope also works. And then in the picture on the left, I actually tied a piece of dental floss around a pen. So something that has a string with a weight at the end of it will be helpful as we move through some of our evaluations. We'll be doing about 7 different evaluations this evening. And again, they're all designed to give you information about your particular puzzle that factors into the function of your pelvic floor. Before we move into that portion of our time together, I want to lay a little groundwork here. Just what are we talking about when we are looking at pelvic floor challenges? Here are some statistics. This is specific to US women, and what they did was they gathered information about US women in 2010, and they looked at US women who had at least one type of pelvic floor challenge or pelvic floor disorder, whether that was urinary incontinence, fecal incontinence, or pelvic organ prolapse. And then they predicted what would come to be, what those statistics would be in the year 2050. And so what we're looking at here is an expected increase by 64% between 2010 and 2050 for women in the US who have at least one form of pelvic floor disorder. And we'll break this down a little more specifically. So looking at urinary incontinence, there's an anticipated increase by 55%, an increase expected of 59% for fecal incontinence, and an increase of 46% in women who experience pelvic organ prolapse. And we're talking millions of women here. So as you can see, it's a problem, and it's a problem that is increasing, and it's a problem that we really, really need to do something about. This is having a huge impact on the quality of life for women. And we also need to take into consideration that when we're talking about pelvic floor challenges, we're not just talking about a deficiency in Kegels. We tend to think, oh, we're having this problem because we're not doing enough Kegels. Well, let's take a look at some of the multitude of pieces that create the puzzle for pelvic floor function. So we can consider movement habits as one category. And under that category, we can look at how you sit, how you stand, the quantity of your movement, and the variety of movement. Now, this is by no means comprehensive, so this is a starting place. And then we can consider lifestyle habits, such as what is your daily stress level? How much anxiety do you have on a regular basis? What are your driving habits? Do you have a really long daily commute? Do you spend a lot of time in your car? What are your sleeping habits? Dietary habits? And then we can look at pregnancy and birth. And I want to be really specific here that not all women who have pelvic floor disorders have been pregnant or given birth. But for those women who have, it can be a piece of the puzzle. So we're looking at things like, what was the length of the pushing stage? Was an episiotomy done? Were interventions such as vacuum extraction and forceps part of the birth process? And then lastly, we can look at body history. such as injuries, surgeries, trauma. And when we think of trauma, and as it relates to the pelvic floor, we tend to think of sexual abuse or rape most commonly. Trauma in general, however, will have an impact on the pelvic floor just by virtue of how our nervous system is wired and the way that the pelvic floor responds when we're in a more activated or sympathetic dominant state of our nervous system. We tend to hold more tension and more contraction in the pelvic floor muscles in response to trauma. And then we also need to consider our culture, because our culture, what we see mirrored around us, is going to have a tremendous impact on how we move, how we hold our body. Something as simple as the tendency to stand for women with their feet more closely together in a Western culture is considered to be more feminine and more demure, to take up less space. All of these things that are associated more with a female ideal, even whether or not you consciously buy into it. So as you can see, we've got a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And there is no way that Kegels are going to be the one-stop shop for addressing all of these pieces to the puzzle. So let's take a broader look, and let's look at, during our time together, we're going to look more specifically at the movement habits piece of the puzzle. We could spend hours talking about this. We could spend hours talking about just the movement habits. However, we have to stop somewhere, and we have a limited time together. So I just want to acknowledge that there's much more than I'm able to share with you in this hour. Nonetheless, you're still going to walk away with some really valuable information that you can begin to implement. Everything that we talk about this evening is designed to emphasize the fact that your pelvic floor is not an island unto itself. The function of your pelvic floor is a reflection of what's going on with your whole body. And we need to stop with this tunnel vision approach to pelvic floor function. And we need to widen our vision and start taking a broader view and addressing the pieces, the multitude of pieces that factor into pelvic floor function. So let's get started. I want to lay one other foundational piece for you. And this graph represents the connection between muscle function and length. The numbers on the left indicate the amount of force that is produced when a muscle contracts. And then the horizontal portion of the graph represents the length of a muscle. So on the far left, we have a muscle in a more shortened state. And the far right, we have a muscle that is in a longer state. And then where the yellow bar is, we have the sweet spot. And the sweet spot indicates the length of the muscle at which it produces the greatest amount of force. So each muscle in your body has a specific length under which it is able to generate the maximum amount of force. If it's too short or if it's too long, it's not able to generate the maximum amount of force. And we want our muscles to be consistently, regularly generating their maximum amount of force. Obviously, it's not something that's going to be done all the time, 24/7, but they need to be able to do that. And the pelvic floor in particular needs to be able to generate force in order to keep things closed that need to remain closed so that we don't pee when we sneeze, And it also needs to be able to relax so that we can empty our bladder, we can have a bowel movement, we can push a baby out if that time should come. And if our pelvic floor muscle is in, or muscles are in a state of contraction ongoing, or are in a shortened state, their ability to generate force is compromised. And that means they are less able to respond appropriately to the load that is being placed upon them. And when I'm talking about loads, I want you to think that throughout your day, there are different demands being placed upon your pelvic floor. So when you're sitting in a chair, your pelvic floor is being asked to do something very different than if you were standing, because the seat of the chair is helping to support your pelvic floor. When you stand, your pelvic floor is needing to participate more. When you walk, even more. When you run, even more. And it needs to be able to reflexively respond to the wide range, hopefully, of loads that are being placed upon it. But we have a problem for most of us in that we don't move very much these days. We spend a lot of time sitting, and then what we do is we go to another extreme where we'll spend the majority of our day sitting, and then we'll say, oh, I really need to get some exercise, and we'll go run for a half an hour or run for an hour or do some other type of high impact activity. We'll go bang it out on the elliptical because we want to burn the calories, we want to get our heart rate going, all of these things that we consider to be beneficial to our health, which is part of our culture, incidentally. And so we go from this extreme of a pelvic floor that's not being asked to do very much for the majority of the day to a pelvic floor that all of a sudden has to really work well to be able to respond to the demands of a higher activity or a higher load that's being placed upon it. And we've got a deconditioned pelvic floor because our body adapts to what it does the most frequently. And if what it is doing the most frequently is sitting in a chair, then it's adapted structurally to that. So we need to move more, we need a greater variety of movement, and we need to give our pelvic floor a variety of loads to respond to throughout the day.